The death sentence disguised as orders. The weight of tomorrow. The mess hall had fallen into an uneasy quiet that evening, the kind of silence that settles over men who sense their fate approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, squadron commander of the 384th Bombardment Group, moved through the rows of young airmen with the measured gait of a man carrying terrible knowledge. His weathered face bore the weight of countless such times when he had to look into the eyes of boys barely old enough to shave and tell them they might not see another sunrise. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the room as Harrison approached Sergeant Tommy Mitchell, a 22-year-old tail gunner from Ohio, who was nervously stirring his coffee with hands that betrayed his youth. The spoon clinked against the ceramic cup in a rhythm that seemed to echo the ticking of a clock counting down precious hours. "Mitchell," Harrison said, his voice carrying the gravity of a funeral director, "get some sleep tonight, son. You're flying tomorrow." Such simple words, 8 syllables that carried the weight of a death sentence whispered in a cathedral. Tommy looked up, his boyish features suddenly aging years in the span of those few seconds. Around him, conversations died as other crew members caught the tone, that particular cadence that every airman had learned to fear more than the sound of incoming flak. The unveiling of destiny. Dawn broke gray and merciless over the English countryside as the crews assembled in Briefing Hut 7. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, its corrugated tin walls bearing witness to countless such gatherings where young men learned they had been chosen for missions that defied survival statistics. Tommy sat in the third row, flanked by his crewmates. Navigator Billy Carson, a former college mathematics professor whose steady hands now trembled slightly as he arranged his charts. Bombardier Jack Romano from Brooklyn, whose wisecracks had fallen silent, and co-pilot Robert Red McAllister, whose freckled face had gone pale beneath his flight cap. They were children playing at being warriors, and this morning, the game had turned deadly serious. The briefing room held perhaps 60 men, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, all of them acutely aware that before the sun set again, some of their chairs would sit forever empty. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of fear sweat, a cologne that had become as familiar as their flight jackets. Colonel Harrison strode to the front of the room, his boots echoing on the wooden floor like a countdown timer. Behind him hung a large map of Europe covered by a white Sheeta theater curtain, concealing the stage where today's drama would unfold. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice cutting through the nervous murmur like a blade through silk, "today's mission will test every ounce of courage you possess. The geography of death." With theatrical precision that would have impressed Broadway, Harrison grasped the corner of the white sheet. The fabric fell away like a burial shroud, revealing the mission that awaited them. A collective intake of breath filled the room's 60 young men, simultaneously understanding that they were staring at their own potential obituary. The red yarn stretched across the map like a trail of blood, leading deep into the heart of Nazi Germany to a target marked with a black circle, the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The route carved through some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, a gauntlet of death that would make the mythical journey through hell seem like a pleasant country drive. "Your target, gentlemen," Harrison announced with the clinical detachment of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis, "lies beyond the reach of fighter escort. You'll be diving through cloud cover in broad daylight at high noon when the sun will offer you no mercy and no concealment. Your mission: bring the Third Reich's aircraft production to its knees through precision bombing and sheer audacity." Tommy felt his mouth go dry. High noon bombing runs were the stuff of nightmares, maximum visibility for enemy fighters, optimal conditions for anti-aircraft gunners, and zero possibility of using darkness as an ally. It was tactical suicide, dressed up as strategic necessity. The mathematics of survival. Harrison's next words would echo through eternity in the minds of those who heard them. The colonel's voice took on the tone of a priest delivering last rites, each word carefully measured and heavy with finality. "I have to tell you, fellows," he said, letting his gaze sweep across the room like a lighthouse beam searching for survivors in a storm, "that if we only get one airplane over that target, it'll be a successful mission." The silence that followed was absolute, not the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. 60 young men simultaneously grasped the cruel mathematics of their situation. They were expendable variables in an equation written in blood and thunder. The mission's success would be measured not in their survival, but in their willingness to die for a strategic objective. Navigator Billy Carson's hands had stopped trembling not from calm, but from the peculiar stillness that comes when fear reaches such intensity that the body simply stops responding. Beside him, Bombardier Romano stared at the map with the hollow expression of a man watching his own funeral procession. Tommy Mitchell felt something cold and crystalline settle in his chest, pure terror, distilled to its essence. This wasn't the manageable anxiety of combat. This was the certain knowledge that he was staring into the abyss of his own mortality, and the abyss was staring back with hungry eyes. The last breakfast. In the mess hall, the usual morning banter had given way to conversations conducted in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might somehow jinx their already minimal chances of survival. Plates of powdered eggs and reconstituted orange juice sat largely untouched. How do you eat when your stomach has transformed into a knot of pure anxiety? Tommy forced down a few bites, knowing he would need his strength for the ordeal ahead. Around him, his crewmates performed the same ritual, each man locked in his own private dialogue with mortality. They were children playing dress-up in the uniforms of heroes, and in a few hours, they would be asked to prove themselves worthy of those costumes. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They had trained for months to become the most efficient killers the sky had ever seen, but in this moment, they felt nothing so much as terribly, achingly young. The ritual of the condemned. After breakfast, the crews dispersed to perform the sacred rituals of men preparing for what might be their final act on Earth. Tommy found himself in the equipment shed, methodically checking his parachutia process that had become as automatic as breathing, yet today carried the weight of genuine life or death consequence. The silk felt different under his fingers this morning, more fragile somehow, as if the fabric understood it might soon be called upon to save a life, rather than simply serve as a confidence-building prop. He traced the rigging lines with the devotion of a priest handling holy relics, knowing that these thin strands of cord might be all that stood between him and a 25,000-foot plunge to Earth. Around him, other airmen performed their own pre-flight ceremonies. Tail gunner Sammy Rodriguez from New Mexico whispered what sounded like a prayer in rapid Spanish while cleaning his .50 caliber machine guns. Ball turret gunner Pete Kowalski from Detroit sat staring at a photograph of a young woman with dark curls, his lips moving silent perhaps, telling her goodbye, perhaps promising to come home. Letters never meant to be read. In the quiet of the crew quarters, Tommy pulled out a piece of V-mail stationery and began to write. His hand trembled slightly as he formed the words, "Dear Mom, if you're reading this, it means I won't be coming home for Christmas like we planned. I want you to know that I'm not afraid. A lie, but one told out of love. I think about you and Dad and little Sarah every day, and I carry your strength with me into the sky. Tell Sarah that her big brother was proud to serve, and that every time she sees an airplane overhead, she should remember that some of us chose to fly so that others could walk free on the ground below. Give Dad my baseball glove, maybe he can teach the neighbor kids how to throw a proper curveball. And Mom, please don't spend your Sundays crying in church. Spend them remembering how we used to laugh when you'd burn the Sunday roast and Dad would pretend it was delicious. I love you all more than the sky is wide. Your son, Tommy." He sealed the letter in an envelope and left it on his bunk, hoping desperately that he would return that evening to tear it up and throw it away, unread. The steel birds of doom. The B-17 Flying Fortress sat on the tarmac like a great metal predator, its 4 Wright Cyclone engines silent, but somehow menacing in their stillness. Hell's Bell. They had christened her a name that seemed prophetically appropriate this morning. Her aluminum skin bore the scars of previous missions, patched holes from flak, replacement panels where German fighters had drawn blood, and the faded remnants of bomb symbols marking successful runs over enemy territory. Tommy ran his hand along the fuselage as he performed his exterior inspection, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm. This machine would carry him into the heart of darkness, suspended between earth and heaven in a realm where death arrived at 20,000 feet, traveling at 400 miles per hour. The bomb bay doors hung open like the jaws of some mechanical whale, revealing row upon row of high explosive ordnance. Each bomb was painted olive drab and stenciled with warning saws if death needed instructions for use. Tommy counted them automatically. 24 100-pound general-purpose bombs, enough destructive power to level a city block, nestled in the belly of their flying fortress like deadly eggs waiting to hatch. The crew's last communion. Navigator Billy Carson spread his charts across a makeshift table near the aircraft's nose, his instruments arrayed before him with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The route to Regensburg snaked across the map like a river of red and Keech waypoint, a potential grave marker, each turn a roll of cosmic dice. "Weather's clear over the target," Carson announced, his voice carrying the hollow cheer of a man trying to convince himself that good bombing weather was actually good news. "Visibility will be unlimited." Unlimited visibility. The phrase hung in the air like a death sentence. Clear skies meant perfect conditions for German fighter pilots to spot them from 50 miles away. It meant anti-aircraft gunners would have unobstructed views for their deadly arithmetic. It meant that when Hell's Bell finally appeared over Regensburg, she would do so under the full, unforgiving gaze of every weapon the Reich could bring to bear. Co-pilot Red McAllister climbed through the aircraft's nose hatch, his face grim. "Engines check out," he reported. "Oil pressure, fuel lines, magnetos, everything's running sweet as can be." His words carried the bitter irony of perfect mechanical reliability, delivering them faithfully toward their doom. The sound of destiny. At precisely 0800 hours, the first engine coughed to life. The Wright Cyclone's roar shattered the morning stillness like a death knell, and soon all four engines were singing their mechanical sangha harmony that managed to be both beautiful and terrifying. The propellers carved through the English air with surgical precision, each revolution bringing them closer to their appointed rendezvous with destiny. Tommy strapped himself into the tail gunner's position, the most isolated and arguably most dangerous station on the aircraft. From here, he would have an unobstructed view of the sky behind them, which meant he would be the first to see German fighters positioning themselves for attack runs. His twin .50 caliber machine guns were loaded and ready, their ammunition belts feeding into the weapons like mechanical intestines. Through his plexiglass turret, Tommy watched the English countryside fall away beneath them as Hell's Bell climbed toward her cruising altitude of 25,000 feet. The patchwork fields grew smaller, more abstract, until England became a green and brown tapestry spread beneath a layer of scattered clouds. Somewhere down there, people were beginning their ordinary day: farmers feeding livestock, shopkeepers opening their doors, children walking to school. The profound normalcy of it all struck him like a physical blow. The formation of the doomed. At 12,000 feet, they began to encounter other aircraft, dozens, then hundreds of B-17S and B-24 Liberators climbing through the thin air to form the massive bombing formation. From Tommy's position, it was a breathtaking sight. An armada of aluminum angels ascending toward heaven, sunlight flashing off their wings like signals from some divine code. But Tommy knew better than to be seduced by the beauty of it. Each of those aircraft carried 10 young men, and statistical analysis had already written the obituaries for a significant percentage of them. The formation was magnificent, and terribly a constellation of potential martyrs arranged in precise geometric patterns, each bomber maintaining exact spacing and altitude to create the defensive firepower necessary for survival. Over the intercom, pilot Captain Michael "Iron Mike" O'Sullivan's voice crackled with static. "We're crossing the English Channel now, boys. Radio silence from here to target. Check your oxygen and pray to whatever gods you favor." The English Channel stretched below them like a gray silk ribbon, marking the boundary between the world they knew and the realm of absolute danger they were entering. Behind them lay safety, routine, the possibility of growing old. Ahead lay Nazi-occupied European landscape bristling with radar installations, fighter bases, and anti-aircraft guns, all of them focused on one simple mission: killing American airmen. Crossing the Rubicon. The French coast appeared through the scattered clouds like the shore of an alien planet. From 25,000 feet, the Nazi fortifications of the Atlantic Wall were barely visible, geometric patterns that gave no hint of the massive concrete bunkers and gun emplacements that bristled along every beach and headland. Tommy knew that even now, German radar operators were tracking their formation, calculating speed and heading, alerting fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft batteries. The temperature at altitude had dropped to 50 degrees below zero. Despite his heated flight suit, Tommy could feel the cold seeping into his bones, making his movements sluggish and his thinking fuzzy. Breath frosted on his oxygen mask, and ice crystals formed on the plexiglass of his turret. This was the realm where human beings were never meant to venture, a frigid, airless void where death could arrive in a dozen different forms. Belgian coast coming up, Navigator Carson announced over the intercom. Turning to heading 095. Estimated time to target, 2 hours, 37 minutes. 2 hours and 37 minutes. Tommy tried to imagine what he would be doing if this were an ordinary Thursday morning. Probably sitting in a college classroom back in Ohio, listening to Professor Henderson drone on about European literature, occasionally glancing at the clock and wishing the period would end. The irony was almost laughable. He had spent so much of his young life wishing time would pass faster, and now he would give anything to slow it down, to stretch these precious minutes into hours or days. The gauntlet begins. The first flak appeared as they crossed into German airspace, tiny black puffs in the distance that looked deceptively harmless, like dark cotton balls scattered across a blue canvas. But Tommy knew better. Each of those innocent-looking puffs represented an 88mm anti-aircraft shell exploding with the force of a small bomb, sending red-hot shrapnel in all directions at twice the speed of sound. "Flak at 11 o'clock, called out Bombardier Romano from the nose. "Light stuff. Probably 20mm. Light stuff." The phrase would have made Tommy laugh if he hadn't been so terrified. A 20mm shell could tear a man in half or punch through an aircraft's wing like tissue paper. But in the deadly hierarchy of anti-aircraft fire, it qualified as light stuff. The formation began to tighten up as they entered the most dangerous phase of their mission. Aircraft that had been maintaining comfortable separation now closed ranks, seeking the mutual protection that only concentrated firepower could provide. From his tail position, Tommy could see the other bombers in his squadron, some flying slightly high, others maintaining perfect formation, all of them threading their way through an increasingly dense field of exploding shells. Jesus Christ! The voice belonged to ball turret gunner Kowalski, and it crackled with sudden terror. "Fighter, coming up from 6 o'clock low. Fuck! Wolf, 190. Tommy swiveled his guns toward the threat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Through the plexiglass, he could see it. A sleek, predatory shape climbing toward them with the single-minded purpose of a shark homing in on blood. The German fighter looked impossibly small and fast, its yellow nose spinner winking in the sunlight like a malevolent eye. The Focke-Wulf opened fire at 800 yards, its wing-mounted cannons flickering like deadly Christmas lights. Tommy watched the tracer rounds arc toward them, graceful, almost beautiful curves of light that belied their lethal intent. At this distance, he couldn't return fire effectively, so he simply watched death approach with the terrible fascination of a mouse hypnotized by a serpent. The crucible of fire and steel. The Focke-Wulf's first burst went wide, the 20mm cannon shells streaking past Hell's Bell's tail like angry hornets. Tommy pressed the triggers of his twin .50 calibers, feeling the guns buck and roar in their mounts as streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds reached out toward the German fighter. The noise inside the turret was deafening, a mechanical thunder that seemed to shake his very soul. The German pilot was good, too good. He rolled his fighter to the left just as Tommy's tracers reached the space where he should have been, then pulled into a climbing turn that brought him around for another pass. Through his headset, Tommy could hear the excited chatter of other gunners throughout the formation. Two more coming in from 10 o'clock high. "I got one. I got the bastard. Mayday. Mayday. We're hit bad. Number 3. Engines on fire." The sky around them had transformed into a three-dimensional battlefield where death traveled at 400 miles per hour. German fighters dove through the bomber formation like wolves attacking a flock of sheep, their guns blazing, while the B-17s maintained their steady course toward the target, their defensive fire creating a deadly web of intersecting tracers. Tommy watched in horrified fascination as a B-17 from the squadron ahead took a direct hit in its bomb bay. The aircraft simply vanished in a brilliant orange fireball that expanded outward like a malevolent flower, taking 10 young men with it in the space of a heartbeat. Where moments before there had been a flying fortress with a crew of boys from places like Nebraska and Tennessee, now there was only falling debris and a black smudge against the sky. The arithmetic of survival. Bandits at 2 o'clock level. Navigator Carson's voice carried a note of barely controlled panic. Jesus, there must be 20 of them. Tommy swiveled his turret and felt his blood turn to ice water. An entire staffel of Messerschmitt Bf 109s was positioning themselves for a coordinated attack, their yellow noses glinting in the sunlight like the fangs of aerial predators. They had formed up in a loose line-abreast formation, preparing to rake the bomber stream with concentrated fire. The mathematics of aerial combat were brutally simple. The German fighters could choose their moment, their angle of attack, their target. The bombers could only maintain course and hope their defensive fire would be enough to discourage or destroy their attackers. It was like being trapped in a shooting gallery where the targets couldn't shoot back effectively. "Hold steady, boys." Captain O'Sullivan's voice cut through the chaos with the calm authority of a man who had faced death so many times it no longer surprised him. "We're 20 minutes from the initial point. Whatever happens, we maintain course and airspeed." 20 minutes. In the ordinary world, 20 minutes was nothing time enough to drink a cup of coffee or read a few pages of a book. At 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany, surrounded by fighters and flak, 20 minutes felt like an eternity stretched on the rack of absolute terror. The Messerschmitts began their attack run, diving toward the formation with the precision of a military drill team. Tommy selected the lead fighter and began tracking it through his gun sight, waiting for the moment when his target would enter effective range. His hands were steady now, the peculiar calm that comes when terror reaches such intensity that it transforms into something else entirely. The dance of death. The air battle that followed would be remembered by those who survived it as 15 minutes of concentrated hell. The German fighters pressed their attacks with suicidal determination, boring in through the bomber formation's defensive fire with a courage that was both admirable and terrifying. Tommy watched tracer rounds stream past his turret like deadly fireflies, each one capable of ending his life if it found its mark. A Messerschmitt dove toward Hell's Bell from above and behind, its nose guns winking with muzzle flashes. Tommy traversed his turret to meet the threat, his twin .50 calibers chattering their mechanical song of destruction. He could see the German pilot clearly now, a young man probably no older than himself, his face grim with concentration behind his oxygen mask. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, hunter and hunted stared at each other across the divide of war. Then Tommy's bullets found their mark. The Messerschmitt's canopy exploded in a shower of plexiglass, and the fighter rolled over and began its final dive toward the earth, trailing smoke and fire like a comet falling from heaven. Tommy felt no triumph, only a sick emptiness in his stomach. He had just killed another human being, a boy, who probably had a mother somewhere in Germany. Perhaps a sweetheart who would wait forever for a letter that would never come. This was the reality of war that the training films and patriotic speeches never mentioned. The moment when you looked into the face of your enemy and saw yourself reflected there. The valley of the shadow. The flak was getting heavier now, so intense that it seemed almost solid, a wall of exploding steel that the bomber formation had to punch through to reach its target. The German anti-aircraft gunners had found their range, and shells were bursting all around Hell's Bell with increasing accuracy. Holy Mary, Mother of God. Ball turret gunner Kowalski was praying over the intercom, his voice barely audible above the thunder of exploding shells. "Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." The hour of our death. The words echoed in Tommy's mind as he watched a piece of flak tear through the wing of a B-17 flying off their starboard side. The bomber continued flying for a moment, then slowly rolled over and began its death spiral toward the earth. Tommy counted parachutes 1, 2, 3, but he knew the rest of the crew was probably dead or trapped inside the falling aircraft. That could be us in the next 30 seconds, he thought. One shell, one piece of shrapnel in the right place, and Hell's Bell would join that other fortress in its final plunge to Earth. IP coming up, Navigator Carson announced, his voice tight with concentration. Turning to bombing heading, Bombardier, it's your show now. The initial point, the last navigation checkpoint before the bomb run. From here, they would fly straight and level for 10 minutes while Bombardier Romano lined up his Norden bomb sight on the target. 10 minutes without evasive maneuvers. 10 minutes of flying predictably while every anti-aircraft gun in the region concentrated its fire on their formation. The final approach. Regensburg appeared through the haze ahead of them like a vision from Dante's Inferno. The city was wreathed in smoke from earlier bombing attacks, and even from their altitude, Tommy could see the geometric patterns of the aircraft factory. That was their target: long, low buildings arranged in orderly rows, the beating heart of German fighter production. But between Hell's Bell and those buildings lay the most intense anti-aircraft barrage Tommy had ever witnessed. The sky ahead was black with flak bursts, so dense it seemed impossible that any aircraft could survive passage through that killing field. It was like flying into the mouth of a volcano, with shells exploding so close that the aircraft shook from the concussion. Bomb bay doors coming open, Romano announced from the nose. The mechanical whine of the door motors was barely audible above the thunder of flak and the roar of engines, but Tommy felt the change in the aircraft's handling as the open doors created additional drag. Straight and level now, Skipper, Romano called to Captain O'Sullivan. I've got the aircraft. No turns, no evasive action. We're committed now. Committed. The word carried the weight of a death sentence. For the next 10 minutes, they would fly as straight as an arrow while German gunners below threw everything they had at the bomber formation. The only variables were luck, fate, and the simple mathematics of probability, and Tommy wasn't confident about any of them. The gauntlet of fire. The flak was so intense now that it created its own weather storm of exploding steel that turned day into artificial twilight. Pieces of shrapnel rattled against Hell's Bell's aluminum skin like deadly hail, and Tommy could feel the aircraft shuddering under the impact of the concussions. Through his turret, he watched a B-17 from the lead squadron take a direct hit just below the cockpit. The nose section simply disintegrated, taking the Bombardier and Navigator with it, while the rest of the aircraft continued flying for several more seconds before slowly rolling over and beginning its death spiral. Tommy closed his eyes, trying to shut out the image of what had happened to the men in that aircraft. "Flak at 12 o'clock level," top turret gunner Rodriguez called out. "Jesus, it's right in front of us." Tommy opened his eyes to see a wall of black smoke and orange fire directly ahead of barrage, so intense it seemed like flying into a solid wall. There was nowhere to turn, nowhere to hide. They had to fly straight through it and hope that chance, luck, or divine intervention would see them through. The explosions were so close now that Tommy could feel the heat from the bursts. Shrapnel hammered against the aircraft's fuselage, and somewhere forward he heard the distinctive whistle of air rushing through a hole in the pressurized cabin. They had been hit, but Hell's Bell continued flying, her right cyclone engines maintaining their steady thunder. 2 minutes to target, Romano announced, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Through his Norden bomb sight, he was lining up on the aircraft factory below, making minute adjustments to ensure their bombs would hit with surgical precision. 2 minutes. 120 seconds that would determine whether their mission and their potential sacrifice would have any meaning. The moment of truth. "Bomb bay doors are open and locked," Romano reported. "Target in sight. Beginning final approach." Through the transparent nose of Hell's Bell, Tommy could see the Bombardier hunched over his bomb sight, making tiny corrections as he tracked their target. Romano's world had narrowed to the crosshairs of his scope, and the geometric patterns of the buildings below everything else, including the flak bursts exploding around them, had ceased to exist. The anti-aircraft fire was reaching a crescendo now, so intense that it seemed impossible any aircraft could survive it. Tommy watched another B-17 off their port side take a hit that tore away most of its left wing. The bomber immediately rolled into a spin, its remaining crew members struggling to escape through whatever hatches they could reach. 30 seconds to release, Romano called out. 30 seconds. Half a minute between this moment and the completion of their mission, assuming they lived that long. Tommy found himself thinking about his mother again, wondering if she was at that very moment hanging laundry on the line behind their house in Ohio, humming one of her melancholy songs while her youngest son prepared to deliver death from the sky. Bombs away. Bombs away. Bombs away. Romano's voice cut through the chaos with the triumphant tone of a man who had just accomplished the impossible. Tommy felt Hell's Bell lurch upward as 24 100-pound bombs dropped from her belly, suddenly relieved of their deadly weight. Through his turret, he could see the other aircraft in their formation releasing their ordnance as well. Hundreds of bombs falling toward the aircraft factory below, like mechanical rain. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The bombs fell in graceful arcs, their olive-drab shapes tumbling end over end as they picked up speed. Tommy found himself holding his breath, watching their destructive cargo reach toward its target with mathematical inevitability. Then the bomb struck. The explosions bloomed across the aircraft factory like deadly flowers, orange and black chrysanthemums of destruction that expanded outward with terrible beauty. Building after building disappeared in the inferno, consumed by the high explosives that had traveled 800 miles from England to deliver their message of war. "Target destroyed," Romano shouted over the intercom. "Direct hits on the main assembly building. The whole damn place is going up." They had done it. Against all odds, through fighters and flak and the simple arithmetic of death, they had reached their target and delivered their bombs with devastating accuracy. The Messerschmitt factory that had produced hundreds of fighters for the Luftwaffe was now a burning ruin, its production capacity reduced to smoke and rubble. But their mission was far from over. Now they had to survive the journey home. The long road home. "Let's get the hell out of here," Captain O'Sullivan announced as he banked Hell's Bell away from the target. "We've done our job. Time to go home." But the German defenses weren't finished with them yet. As the bomber formation began its withdrawal, fighters appeared again, fresh squadrons that had been held in reserve, waiting for the moment when the American bombers would be most vulnerable. The B-17s were lighter now, having dropped their bomb loads, but they were also lower on fuel and ammunition, and their crews were exhausted from the strain of combat. Tommy swiveled his turret to track a Messerschmitt that was climbing toward them from below, its pilot clearly intent on adding another American bomber to his victory tally. The German fighter opened fire at long range, its cannon shells arcing toward Hell's Bell like deadly meteors. This time, Tommy was ready. He led the target perfectly, squeezing off short, controlled bursts that converged on the climbing Messerschmitt. His armor-piercing incendiary rounds found their mark, and the German fighter suddenly sprouted flames from its engine cowling. The pilot rolled his aircraft over and bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. Another life taken, another young man who would never see his homeland again. Tommy felt the same sick emptiness he had experienced with his first kill, but there was no time for philosophical reflection. More fighters were approaching, and the battle for survival was far from over. Counting the cost. As they crossed back into Allied airspace 2 hours later, Tommy began to take inventory of their formation. Of the 36 B-17s that had taken off from England that morning, only 24 were still flying. 12 aircraft and their crews, 120 young men had paid the ultimate price for their successful attack on the Messerschmitt factory. Hell's Bell herself bore the scars of battle. Her fuselage was peppered with flak holes. Her port wing had a jagged tear where a 20mm shell had passed through without exploding, and her tail section looked like a metal colander. But her engines were still running smoothly, and her controls responded to O'Sullivan's touch. "We're going to make it," the pilot announced over the intercom, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "We're actually going to make it home." Home. The word had never sounded so beautiful. Tommy thought of the base in England waiting for them, hot food, warm beds, and the simple miracle of being alive to see another sunset. They had flown into the heart of Nazi Germany and emerged victorious, having struck a blow that would echo through the war effort. But the victory had come at a terrible price. 12 crews would not be returning to their quarters that evening. 12 sets of parents would receive telegrams beginning with the words, "We regret to inform you." 12 young women would wait forever for letters that would never come. The weight of survival. That evening, as Tommy sat in the mess hall with the other survivors, he pulled out the letter he had written to his mother that morning, the letter he had hoped never to send. He stared at it for a long moment, then slowly tore it into pieces and let them fall into the wastebasket beside his table. He would write another letter that night, a different one. He would tell his mother about the successful mission, about the aircraft factory they had destroyed, about the friends they had lost along the way. But he would not tell her about the German pilots he had killed, or about the moments when he had stared directly into the face of his own mortality and somehow survived. Some experiences were too heavy to share, too dark to burden others with. The weight of survival, the knowledge that he had lived while others had died, the responsibility of carrying forward the memory of those who hadn't made it home, that was his burden to bear alone. Outside, the English countryside settled into its evening quiet, peaceful and normal, and utterly oblivious to the drama that had played out in the sky that day. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another roll of the cosmic dice. But tonight, Tommy Mitchell was alive, and that was miracle enough. As Colonel Harrison had said that morning, if even one airplane reached the target, it would be a successful mission. They had gotten more than one through, but the cost had been measured in the lives of young men who would never grow old, never marry their sweethearts, never see their children born. Such was the arithmetic of war. Victory measured not in what was gained, but in what was sacrificed to achieve it.